Welcome, everybody. That was very rousing, I'm sure you'll all agree. So it's got us in the right mood to think about all of the different ways in which we can think about and talk about the challenge of the Anthropocene. And I'm really delighted to be welcoming Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty tonight. Dipesh is the Lawrence A. Kimpton Distinguished Service Professor of History of South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. Dipesh, it's a great pleasure to have you with us tonight, and thank you very much for joining us. So, as we've just heard, the format for tonight is a conversation between Dipesh and myself. We've discussed a few topics that we thought would be interesting to give you an insight into Dipesh's many great works on questions of colonialism, decoloniality, the history of Europe, but most importantly for today's discussion, his work on climate change and how we understand the Anthropocene and our future in it. So that's going to be the focus of our conversation. We think that conversation will run for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. So I hope that this will inspire you to be thinking how you want to engage with some of these questions and what you think of as some of the challenges of the Anthropocene that you'd like us to discuss. So Dipesh, as I said, you've been working on this now for some time. I think we could probably quite easily say one of the first historians to bring climate change and questions of the Anthropocene into that discipline and to start to think about what does it mean to take a humanities perspective on climate change and to bring that into that whole field of research. And you've done so by thinking very deeply about this question of the Anthropocene. And often I think when we hear about the Anthropocene as a term, we consider it as something which is into the future and maybe in some senses something we're going to have to deal with. But I think obviously bringing historical perspective, you also tell us that the Anthropocene matters for our past as well. So I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit about how you came to think about the idea of the Anthropocene and what does it mean to you to understand the Anthropocene both historically and into the future. Thank you.
No, thank you. I mean, this came completely unexpectedly into my life. I was a historian of, as you said, anti-colonialism and modernization and the place of Europe in our lives and provincializing Europe. It's exactly 25 years ago that I published Provincializing Europe. And it's around 2003 that I got interested in the Anthropocene. So it seems to be another 25 years would be spent working on climate change as I come to my retirement age. So when I began to work on it, I was saying that, during the day in our discussions, it came to me as an accident. I hadn't heard of even climate change, forget the Anthropocene. Like, as you said, most historians hadn't, which was already 15 years or more after the IPCC had been set up. So it says something about how disciplines were not communicating, and even at the end of the millennium, at the end of the 2000, people were writing histories about the 20th century without mentioning anything of climate change. Keith Thomas's famous book, Man and Nature, right? Man and the Natural World. When did that come out? In 1983, around 1983. And the ozone hole was being talked about from the 70s, confirmed in 83, 84. And he mentioned a lot of ecological stuff. He doesn't mention this one. Right? Bernhard Stiegler, the German philosopher of technology, his book comes out in 1988. He mentioned the ozone layer, but no climate change.
Yeah.
So when I look at our disciplines, we were slow to pick up on this question. And when I got interested for very personal reasons. That I grew up in Calcutta, and Calcutta was there was no outdoors in Calcutta except on screen when you went to watch a film. And I found the outdoors during my doctoral years in Australia. Canberra gave you lots of outdoorsy experience. And some of the nature spots I came to love got destroyed by a horrendous fire that also killed some people and animals. 2003, that's when people said it's climate change, and I began to read up on climate change, and I was stunned to discover that they were talking about humans with our technology having become a geological force or agent. And geology was one of my minor subjects. And I loved Canberra because in Canberra there's an underpass, where you were driving through Canberra, if you've been.
Yes.
On one side you have folds in rocks. On the other side you have faults in rocks. And I thought, wow, this was explaining my undergraduate geology during my doctoral years. The city had been built to explain this to me, because in India you only saw hand-drawn pictures of folds and faults if it was a minor subject. And so when I knew that a geological agent is a humongous thing, like a volcanic eruption, or like the asteroid that got rid of the dinosaurs. And so when they were saying humanity has become I just couldn't wrap my head around this conception. I thought this is a tremendous expansion of scale of our impact or whatever. In fact, even when I learned about Anthropocene and I went back to Calcutta to speak to my friends, there was an old teacher who used to publish a Bengali magazine, and I had been promise bound to contribute an article a year until his death. And I wrote, because by that time, 2020 was meant to be the critical year.
Yes.
Right? Remember?
It
That
always goes
beyond
forward a little bit more.
we keep pushing it back. Right now it's 2050.
It is.
Decarbonization by 2050. So there's political bargaining about when the crisis will come.
Yes.
And so I wrote, and I'm from a cricket-loving country, so I said, another kind of 2020, my article. And nobody sank without a trace. And my Bengali friend said to me, they're all Western interests. Why are you working on Western people's interests? Work on our history. And they just wouldn't have anything to do with my intellectual friends, with what I was trying to say. And one day, in Chicago, I was speaking to an old college friend who was a geologist, a field geologist. And I said to him, this geologist is saying this about humanity. And this was around 2007. And he said, oh yeah, there's an article that just come out in the American Geological Association's newsletter, in the form of a letter, saying humanity has entered the Anthropocene. And the lead author, I think, was Jan of that letter, who became a friend later on, and who's been the chair of the Anthropological Working Group ever since I've known him. And so I went there and found the word Anthropocene. And then all these geological terms entered my head, Pleistocene and Holocene, Holocene stability. I still remember meeting Jan later on in Berlin for the first conference on Anthropocene at the World of House Culture, the House of World Cultures. And in the car that took us to the place, and I just published my Bengali article in English translation as the Climate of History 4 thesis. I still remember, I'll never forget it, I still remember him telling me that, all these big rivers like the Amazon, Mississippi, Ganges, they all found their present level 6,000 years ago. The deltas and these things were formed, and then you have the urban civilization. I never forgot it, because before he said that to me, my father had died. And I was back in Calcutta doing what Hindus do, or Brahmins do, whatever. I was in the river, Ganges, kind of letting go of his last remains. And there were so many people around me doing it that the river actually seemed eternal for my little human life. And when you go in there and you see a lot of people doing the same things, like a religious ritual, whatever. And I thought this river has been flowing forever. Humans have been dying forever. And sons like me have been getting into the river. Women do this. So, but then to think the river in this form was only 6,000 years old, or whatever, not eternal at least. Yeah. So you see, my sense of time, my sense of these things that you normally don't think about, like there's a wonderful line in Wittgenstein's collection of thoughts, really, not essays, called Uncertainty. And in one of the thoughts he says, we ask of a building, how old is it? Which is totally true. We often look at buildings. I mean, today I was asking about this building and learned that this was Gladstone's residence. Yeah. And why don't we ask this of mountains? And totally true. My sense of Indian geography was that there was the sacred Ganges flowing forever, the sacred mountains with gods living on the hills on top, and the Indian Ocean, yeah. Right? And Wittgenstein himself says because they constitute a permanent background for our everyday life.
So
Then he says something very interesting. He said it's because we assume that the mountain is eternal, we can make finer distinctions between truth and falsity, yeah. What's true and what is false. So he said if the background was in total movement, our thoughts would be in chaos. So I just had this feeling of being suddenly, taken away from under my feet. Husserl, in one of his essays, said, talking about being an astronomer, he said, when I go to my observatory, what I look at through the telescope is moving. So I know cognitively that this earth is also moving, but this earth under my feet doesn't move. Yeah. Every day I take the same road to the observatory. So I thought something tremendously important had happened to the human condition. And this idea that friends later talked about moving away from the Holocene stability, the kind of stable world that we had inherited for generations, giving minor ups and downs at Middle Age and all that, was ending. And as a historian, you always faced with the question, tell me when I'm going on for too long.
I will. You Good. Carry on. I want the okay. historian's perspective.
Right, okay. So as a historian, I was thinking, what will I do with this knowledge? The first thing I did was write in Bangla, then in English, I wrote the 4 thoughts I had. And I think the most important thought was that I had been brought up as a historian to think that natural history either was cyclical, as Brodel had said, the trade winds came and went, the flowers blossomed and disappeared, the seasons did their work. But human history was independent of natural history, relatively, because as Stalin had said in his, growing up in Calcutta, just as once in Scotland, all the good people became priests. In Calcutta, in my generation, all the idealistic people became Marxists. So we had to read a tract of Stalin's. I'll give you E.P. Thompson's, the historian E.P. Thompson's name for it, and you'll know what the original name was. Or maybe I'll give you the name, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. And E.P. Thompson used to call it Diabolical and Hysterical Materialism. And in that diabolical and hysterical materialism, Stalin, it was like a catechism. So we almost learned it by heart. And where Stalin said, does nature have any influence on human history? He said, no, nature takes thousands of years to change, but society changes within 100 years. So that's what we had learned. So it was an assault on all of this, the very fundamental understanding of what is the historical context. Because in history, in anthropology, you explain people by referring them back to their context. So it was kind of quite revolutionary impact on my... So I began to read up on climate science, and eventually I, through Jan became a tremendous mentor through those years, because he was the expert in all this. He would send me everything he wrote, not everything, but things that he thought I would understand, be of use to me, and I began to think. So I'll say, make this the last point. And people were immediately either taken. Many people were either taken with what I wrote in English, or many people were angry that I was not blaming capitalism enough, having come from a Marxist background. So in the meanwhile, there was a French philosopher, Catherine Malabou, who's been a very interesting philosopher of the human brain and what she calls the plasticity of the brain. She was interested in my article and actually wrote an essay, partly critiquing me from her point of view about the deep history of the brain and everything. And when I met her, and also in writing, she said, and she said to me personally, she said, Dipesh, you realize that the word globe in globalization doesn't mean the same thing as the word globe in global warming. Because the word that is, you can't read about the globe that is warming up without getting far back into its history. Because people were digging up, people had to prove, first of all, that the current warming was remarkable, say even for 800,000 years. Yeah. So they were doing it by boring into the polar ice cap and bringing up ancient air bubbles and studying them for temperature, right? And the ironical thing was, of course, if you want to drill into ice, you basically use oil industry's gear, kind of adjusting it for ice. And they were showing that, this was at least unique. So I was reading this history, opened up, and I was kind of reading the kind of history I'd normally not read. Because normally I wouldn't even read prehistory. I went to Australia and I was surprised that there was a group of people called Aboriginal people whose history, just after before 200 years, became archaeology. Whereas in India, we don't talk to archaeologists. They do a period that we don't do, right? So history expanded. The canvas expanded. And as I worked more with Catherine Malabou's idea that the two globes were different, I began to eventually make a distinction by calling one of them the globe and the other one the planet. And what I meant by that was that the globe is a 500-year-old entity which is about the history of European expansion, European taking over of other people's lands, making other people's into slaves, dominating other people, the rise of capitalism, the invention by Europeans, of ships that could actually negotiate deep seas. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to expand in this kind of way. Carl Schmitt tells a story beautifully in the history of whaling. Whaling was a coastal affair, and it's only with deep sea going vessels that you could actually go and kill whales in the ocean. Whereas I also realized that there is another history that people like Jan deal with, which goes into billions of years. So the first 1 billion year of this planet without life, right? Then then life comes. Then this thing called Great Oxidation Event, which happens about 2.5 billion years ago, right? When there's more oxygen in there because of these algae type creatures. And sometimes, I'll tell you this, in my head there's a dialogue going on between my two sides. The anti-colonial, pro-justice, whatever side, the anti-racist, and this other history that was opening up. And when I was reading about the first kind of expansion of oxygen in the air, I realized that it killed so many other creatures that lived off nitrogen, right? They either went underground or they were killed. And so many of these nitrogen-fixing and other kinds of bacteria were killed that the scientific name for this event is oxygen holocaust, because oxygen was a poisonous gas. And I thought humans wouldn't have come along without that murderous event. So if these creatures were human, that would have been a holocaust. So I also realized that in the history of life, survival is the point. There is no justice. I mean, we are the products of a grave injustice, if you want to call it so, in the history of life, right? Not us alone, but I think our kind of creatures wouldn't have come along. So the other interesting thing, I'll say as a historian, I'm just sharing with you how it was exploding my mind, was that Jan, and I think, did you write it yourself or you include some of the Goldilocks planet? With Mark Williams. So they have a book called The Goldilocks Planet, two geologists, where the question is, why is, and this was a question of the Gaia people and Carl Sagan's Unit 2 in NASA, you know, there's no life, at least now, on Mars. Why is Venus so hot? Why is Mars so cold? And why is this planet exactly right for life? So they called it, it's called by many people, the Goldilocks planet. And this question of, so what are the conditions of life? And then I realized, reading this literature, that this is not just a biologist's question. The biologist would say life begins when chemistry becomes biology. But Schrödinger gave a series of lectures in 1939 in Dublin. This is a physicist. What is called life? What is life? And it's a thermodynamic approach to life. And then I realized this question was coming up in NASA when Lovelock joined 61, Carl Sagan's unit, and they were thinking of eventually making Mars habitable. So this question comes of what makes a planet habitable.
Yeah.
So I realized that the global is my old historian category. Global contains colonialism, global contains racism in a particular way. I mean, you can't think of the global. So the global is purely political to begin with. But this planet is so old, the stories, and so random. Like, I found it amazing that when I read history of, 4.5 billion years, it seems one thing after another. There's no social cause.
Until now. Until we think about the idea of humanity as a singular force. And
right.
Does it start to get less random as we start to think about
our history becomes, right. That's true. But I was thinking, whereas in social science, even 20 years you cut out randomness, right? 200 years you cut out randomness. Otherwise you can't have theories of capitalism, this, that, because it could be random. So I was very struck by what the change of scale does to our sense of it. So let me stop there and say, that's where it all began, with an explosion within my head.
Yes.
And I was trying to express the explosion in several articles, most of the time not to the satisfaction of my readers.
Well, it certainly had a massive influence on how people think about these ideas, even if not always that people would agree with you. And perhaps one of the areas which has been most critiqued is the idea of the kind of singularity of humanity as a force in the planet. And I wonder whether you might want to just reflect on that.
Sure.
What as we start to think of humanity as a geological force, how does that shape our other understandings of what it means to be a person and in the planet or in the global?
Okay, so let me go back to the question first about the singularity hypothesis. So one of the criticisms, because I had used the word Anthropocene, having just learned about it from my geologist friends. So one criticism was that you're blaming the anthropos for the global warming, as if the anthropos is one thing, it's differentiated between rich and poor, and the inequality has a lot to do with warming. Some people thought inequality was the cause of warming, and therefore you were guilty of essentializing in some ways humanity. That was the charge. But the history of the word is very interesting, and later on Jan may extend on it. But from reading these people, I understand that Paul Crutzen, the Dutch scientist who worked in Germany as an atmospheric chemist, and who was one of the people who found a temporary solution for the hole in the ozone layer, and was given the Nobel Prize for it. By then, 1983, NASA set up a subcommittee. After having discussed Gaia and that, it's called a subcommittee for Earth system science. So by then, they were actually coming to the realization with this multiple scientists, multiple groups of interdisciplinary scientists working together, that the that the geological and biological processes that come together to support life in general on this planet, kind of in the climate system and everything, it's sort of system-like. It has some systemic properties. And so they called it Earth System Science, right? 83, and then, so they were thinking this, it behaves as a system, and therefore the scientists, of course, are not critics of capitalism. They don't, it's not part of the curriculum. So innocently they said, this is one system. And in one of the meetings in 2000 in the Mexico City of the Earth System scientists, where everyone was going about Holocene and what was happening to Holocene, Paul Crutzen, apparently unable to bear the din about Holocene, suddenly blurted out in frustration, and to the surprise of everybody else in the audience, stop talking about the Holocene, this is Anthropocene. It's about man's impact, human's impact on the planet. He didn't talk about capitalism. And the thing was, so eventually Jan was tasked to set up the stratigraphic commission. Now, so the baby then fell into geologist's lap, because Crutzen was not a stratigrapher or a geologist. He just wanted to express his sense of how big the impact had been. So he thought if I called it Anthropocene, Capitalocene scientists wouldn't understand. Right? So if they have Anthropocene, the story would be obvious to everybody. So he said the Anthropocene. And I always think of, that Pirandello play called 6 Characters in Search of an Author, where the character has been born, but the author hadn't been born. So Jan and his committee was the author. Normally in geology, this is what I learned from them, that the naming comes after the evidence has been found. Here it was reversed. The name had happened first. And they had to go around finding the evidence to justify the name. Whether the name is justified or not is their question, but enough evidence to show that the impact was tremendous. And so when I used it, I had this criticism. There was not that the criticism was pointless. There was some point to it. But the discussion we were having today, I often think that sometimes what looks from one day's perspective like not something, an event that is not representative of everybody. So I remember I was growing up in India when, and I was very anti-American, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon. And remember, he said that sentence which had some grammatical error in it, was later fixed, when he said, one small step for a man and a big step for mankind. And even in my little, 14, 15-year-old, whatever head I was, I thought, BS, mankind, that's American. It's one small step for an American, it's a big step for an American, for the American people. You represent American people. What do you mean you represent mankind? And that was my thought then. But then over time, the Chinese have done it, Russians have done it, or have sent things. So if you look at it as a series, the event actually as a series becomes more representative. But just a snapshot might not express the representativeness of an event to which others were aspiring to, right? So, so for me, I used the word Anthropocene in one chapter. There's Anthropocene Time, a chapter in my book. So I was not opposed to Anthropocene. Capitalocene did some other work for me, which is emphasizing the role of capital, and I'll come back to that. Yeah. But I worked more with the globe and the planetary distinction, because Anthropocene or not, I had seen the other thing that was making itself obvious in our life, that we were increasingly asking how old are the Himalayas? Yeah. When did the Ganges begin? Somebody has just published a geological history of India showing that one of the major rivers, I think the Brahmaputra, if I'm not mistaken, is pre-Himalayan. We worship the Himalayas as kind of giving us the rivers, but there's another one river, major river, that's actually geologically from before the mountains. And Himalayas are 50 million years old, young by mountain standards, And there's landslides happening because the Chinese and the Indians are either becoming battle ready or infrastructure development. Therefore, they dynamite the mountain. And if you're dynamiting a mountain that is still growing, so imagine the actual border about which Indians and Chinese fight is actually shifting, both in elevation and probably as elevation happens because the Himalayas grow this much and then kind of lose a little bit of the growth. So the actual border is shifting. So today, it wouldn't be a surprise for a newspaper reader in English in India to know that the Himalayas are young as mountains go, because this news is percolating into our life, right? The geology is becoming, some kind of geology is becoming part of it. We know of carbon dioxide, excessive carbon dioxide. We know about the seas warming, sea levels going up, storms. We know about climate change, often episodically, as episodes happening. So it's...
so the planetary is becoming more familiar.
So the planetary is becoming more... the planetary is becoming... Is this better? Somebody should have told me beforehand. The planetary is becoming more relevant. Not that everybody uses it in my sense. People use it in other sense, but at least, I always think a powerful word catches on because it means many different things to different people. In Foucault's time, everybody was talking about power, meaning different things. So it has become a powerful word. A word and culturally powerful words are seldom precise. The popularity of the word happens at the expense of the precision of its meaning.
Yes,
yeah.
For sure. But you were saying also that you found the idea of the Capitalism helpful for thinking about this, maybe connecting some of your work on the histories of modernity and colonialism
right.
into how we understand the planetary now.
Yeah. So I found capitalism because so when you look at, there's these great graphs that Earth system scientists produced with the help of a very prominent and eminent environmental historian called John McNeill. And these graphs are like 101 for climate change, called the Great Acceleration Graph, which basically shows that if you look at anything that speaks of human flourishing, like number of people alive, today we're discussing longevity, how long people live for, food available, all of these things have grown exponentially from about 1950. And if you can resolve the graph, then they become even more steep post-1970. And then if you look at the way that the planet, the Earth, has responded to it in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and other indices, you will find they also increase exponentially from 1950. So they're correlational. I'm not saying they're causal. And so it was clear that in the 50s, it was about OECD nations reconstructing, Japan and Europe. But as you go into the 70s and 80s, it becomes much steeper once the Chinese and the Indians begin to liberalize, modernize, and the creation of a global economy. I would think from Thatcher and Reagan's time on, but very sharply from the 1990s. So you have a creation of both worldwide inequality has grown. There's no question. I think Thomas Piketty is right that inequality has grown. But there are also new middle classes. And whether you call it capitalism, development, modernization, whatever, but the market economy was growing. And so the kind of contradiction we are left with now. So before I tell you the contradiction, the very, very interesting fact is that the Harvard psychologist Steve Pinker, who published a book in 2018, the Great Acceleration Graphs were drawn 2015, the first time. And Steve Pinker is a gung-ho optimist about the future. That's why he says we need more reason, more enlightenment, and more enlightenment has helped us. So he gives actually graphs of human flourishing without realizing that if he had reproduced the Earth system graphs, how the planet was responding to those figures, he would have been reproducing the Great Acceleration graphs. But because he doesn't look at greenhouse gas emissions and these sort of things, he said we are intelligent enough to deal with that. it's a tremendously optimistic book without realizing that humans have, in my lifetime, it's exactly my lifetime, humans have flourished as they've never have in the past. So just think of longevity. Up until the 18th century, average longevity was under 30. Most humans died under 30. Before the Second World War, it was 46, 50. Now, of course, it's 70 in some places, 80 in other places. My pension advisors always say, prepared to live to be alive until 95. So, and so incrementally. So, but I kind of think, okay, you've lived very well. Now the bill has come. And the bill, unfortunately, has to be paid not by my generation. My generation has really had it good. The bill will have to be paid by the future people, our children. And that's why, in fact, I don't know what you find in this country, but I find in American classroom, young people are not confident that they'll have a good future.
Yeah.
And there are very interesting signs of that, but they are not at all confident that they will. And this may very well be true, or who knows. But I'm saying that's so. One of the propositions we're discussing this afternoon was that the infrastructure that humans have laid out to live well, to flourish, everything that actually ensures that we'll live long, we'll live well, we'll eat well, doesn't sit very well with the infrastructure, so to speak, that the planet has produced over billions of years to support different forms of life. So we have agriculture that does a lot of damage, not just insecticide, pesticides, but also, say with bananas, for instance. Suppose you want everybody in the world to have bananas, because we've globalized food, right? Salmon is farmed and sold everywhere. Because you have the same treatment for diabetes, doctor tells you eat salmon. So when you globalize bananas, you'll find that basically there are two varieties of banana that lend themselves to be globalized. Other varieties don't. So in a way, you are kind of selecting for a loss of the gene pool, variety of gene pool. So you're actually making bananas more vulnerable to some disease or something. So similarly, when you when you farm fish, China is the biggest farming of fish. All of these things there are some salmon farms where the Tasmanian salmon, there's been a study of it, that the sea underneath has become a dead zone.
Yeah.
And a couple of friends of mine have just written a book on antibiotics in India. And they describe antibiotics as the fossil fuel of the medical world, in which we have used it mainly for farming stock and these things. So in many ways, so how do we think about this moment? I am saying we have lived really well. And there's a book by, you might know the name, by an Englishman, an archaeologist who works for a museum. I want to say that the second name is Hage, but I could be wrong. Sorry? Yeah, the book is called The End of the Human Empire, right? No, okay.
Any more heckling on book names? Welcome.
So,
we'll Google it afterwards.
Right. In the book, he makes a very interesting point. He said, just as with the Roman Empire or with the British Empire, you can only study the fall of an empire from its peak.
Yeah.
Or retrospectively, you know that was the peak when you study the decline.
Yeah.
Right? And there is always this doubt that are we at that peak of human flourishing?
And Dipesh, if we are at the peak of human flourishing globally, we also have to think about what the politics of its decline might be. And you've also written very interestingly about the challenge of the political in the planetary era. And I'm wondering whether you might share some of your thoughts about that, because we think of the planetary as unitary, but the political as fragmented and multiple.
Yeah.
And what does that tell us about the kinds of politics that we might expect, potentially, as we see this kind of decline and fall of the current situation?
So I'll talk about two things, maybe more, but let me talk about two things that come to mind. One is the scenario from looking at it from America. There's a lot of stuff that happens on the ground which is good, but many American universities in Biden's time, this is slightly set up climate institutes because Biden had put aside something like $600 billion for technical innovations like lithium batteries or sodium batteries, carbon capture and sequestration, and climate engineering. So we have an institute where there's a very prominent man, my colleague David Keith, who has been doing research on climate engineering for a very long time. And his argument, he recently wrote a guest essay in New York Times. And his argument was that the warming is such that even if we stopped emitting today, the warming will continue. And probably with India and China industrializing more, the warming, and other countries coming up, the warming will become worse. So he is saying there's an emergency. Decarbonization will or will not happen. So he is arguing that we make arrangements to dim sunlight by 1 degree, the effect of sunlight, by spraying aerosol particles. He acknowledges that aerosol particles are bad for the ozone layer. So he says it's not a panacea. But to buy time, we will, what's happened recently is they found out that because of Chinese clearing up their skies and the particulate pollution, that we've now realized that the warming is accelerating because the pollution was keeping the temperature down. The pollution has a cooling effect. So he is saying we will just bring it down to the same degree that the pollution was bringing it down. And what will happen after that? And he said, I can't predict what the effect on the rainfall will be in the world. It could be uneven. But he says, if society wants this, society will have to make sure that we stop the spraying so that the temperature doesn't go down any further, because the ozone hole will be destroyed, right? And see how underspecified the word society is. I'm quoting verbatim from his essay. If society wants this. Yeah. Because he doesn't know who are the agents that will make the decisions. And when I read my French friend Jean-Baptiste Fresso's a book called No Transition, that you don't transition, he also begins by saying we must resist the techno-fixers. But that we is as underspecified as this one. Yes. So I think if you think of climate problem as defined by IPCC, decarbonization by 20, we've missed the bus. And there may not be a political response addressing climate crisis as a whole, but that doesn't mean that there is no other responses. So if you look at, I myself have a small suggestion, which I made to UNESCO once, but my Indian diplomatic friends quickly told me that this is very unpractical. So there are 8 or 9 rivers coming out of the Himalayas, from Pakistan to Vietnam. Between these countries, you have 47% of the world's population. 50% of the world's population are actually serviced by the glaciers of Himalayas. Yes. So my idea was to have a multilateral authority protecting the health of the Himalayas, but the nation states would have to cede some of their authority to these multilateral bodies. And that's where you get stuck. So the nation states are playing their own, nation states, I once gave a speech to a bunch of Indian parliamentarians visiting, and I said, do your geopolitics, but get it informed by geology. The geo must not only be geography, because geography is in movement. And of course, that's exactly what they don't want to hear. So their politics is all about anachronistic politics. The assumptions are anachronistic. But on the other hand, so I'm just saying that that's something to do. Similar argument might be made with the Amazon forests, because that is also distributed between several nation states. At the same time, for the poor on the coasts of India, Bangladesh, climate change is every day. It's happening. I went to Kerala, and I was giving a lecture, and a physics professor stood up and said that she wrote a letter to the governor of the state who didn't respond, but she was saying, Dipesh, if you go to the coastline, you will find that the poor women have to go much further to get fresh water to cook with, because you can't cook with salty water.
Yeah.
But the rivers have become saline, right,
Yeah.
near the coast. So I was telling the story of the fisher women folk who are getting infections from the saline water because they stay. And so often I look and I say, look, in the 70s, feminists taught us that the personal is political. And I now say it is political, and sometimes it's almost political in a planetary manner. Right? The women who are getting infections in the womb are getting infections because the seas are rising and moving into fresh water. There was a young anthropologist in Calcutta who actually worked with Susan Bailey in Cambridge, came to me one day, and she is very interested in auspicious sounds. So Hindu households have a ritual of blowing a conch shell, an empty conch shell in the evening, right? And it's meant to be, it's old Hindu and Buddhist traditions. It's a sacred, the sound is sacred. Now these conch shells the shells take 3 years to mature. And because of global warming and raising temperature, they are not maturing. They don't get the 3 years time. So you can't blow the small shells. So suddenly the sacred sound is gone. They're trying to make shells with plastic and clay. They don't exactly produce the same sound. So there's a crisis in the Hindu sense of the protection of the domestic sphere. So there's a crisis in the ritual sphere. So look at how planetary can enter your life, leaving you with all kind of decisions to make. And then there's the political sphere, which is, I really think at the topmost level, the political sphere is not just in many parts of the world corrupt. And I'll give you one example. My greatest example of that corruption is sand. Because of the construction boom in India and China and the United States, we're running out of sand. Because we're already running out of sand. So if you look at national government laws, you will find that the laws are very strict about getting sand. You know, the problem with sand is that you would say, well, why don't we take it from the deserts? Desert sand is blown into spherical shape by the wind. And so you need these kind of rectangular, bodies, rectilinear, exactly, that can adhere and has a surface, because here's a surface point where you touch is small. So they are destroying rivers to dredge illegally sand. They can't do it from beaches so much, it's public, but rivers you can go, follow the course of the river and go where people are not going. And illegal sand is much cheaper than legal sand. But so we're on the one biodiversity problem, sand problem, and so in America now, there's another proposal which is called climate realism. And that's been made by the World Council on, what is it called? I want to say War and Peace, but it's not War and Peace, Foreign Relations. It is, which is for America, is War and Peace. But, but they say that there should be climate realism. So once there was climate denial, and now there's acknowledgement of the science, but defiance. So they're actually saying, accept that humanity, they use the word, will blow through all the targets that IPCC sets. And that the average warming would be 3 degrees at the end of the century. On the internet, you can go and find mobile images that the World Bank used to produce to help you visualize the coastlines at different. 3 degrees is a quite unrecognizable world. And so they say America will be affected. So what you have to do is develop resilience,
retreat,
adaptation, and make alliances so that China and India's emissions are restricted. Now that's, if it put into practice, it will be another kind of imperialism, right? So I don't know if it will be totally accepted, but there's a debate going on. Within India, I mean, China, of course, has become famous for solar power stuff. I don't see at any level, the IPCC targets being addressed. But so I think the possibilities are at lower levels. And here is the complexity. Just the lower level politics works best if society and governments are democratic. Whereas all this is happening just when governments are becoming more autocratic and populists. And I think that's another huge problem because, so I think the climate problem is actually also an argument for democracy.
Yeah.
And every fight you fight to retain democracy, make democracies more transparent, respondent, you help the climate cause because you actually help to bring to people's attention what's happening to small people.
Yeah. So Dipesh, is that where you see the possibility for hope? Because you've told us multiple things that are happening
So
that
from
are challenging.
something, but also one part of my hope is from my old Marxist background or past. One is, of course, Ernst Bloch, Position of Hope. But the other one is Rosa Luxemburg saying, have faith in the crisis. So, and I'm not joking. I sometimes think that Europe underwent a lot of crisis in the 17th century, that historians call the 17th century crisis.
Imaginatively so.
Imaginatively so, exactly. And it's about the religious wars, crisis of sovereignty. So when you read Grotius's book on sovereignty, it's fascinating to read how his theories of new sovereignty don't come out of simply big philosophical contemplations. So for instance, he's recommending that you go and loot or kind of do piracy on Portuguese pirates because he says the seas don't belong to anybody. And they've gotten rid of the Arab traders doing piracy. So we should do the other aspiring national states to do the same thing. But that's how he gets to eventually a theory of sovereignty. And you get Hobbes and Locke, Pufendorf and all these people. So I think my hope is that one day this crisis, because nobody is attending to it at the biggest level, people are attending to it at other intermediate levels, if at all. My proposal for a multilateral has been...
Not yet.
Well, exactly. So I'm hoping that the crisis will push us to points where we'll be forced to do that. And at that point, maybe, if you think of sovereignty in Hobbes, the job of the sovereign is to protect life and property. And maybe one day the sovereign power's job will be to protect all forms of life, protect our life and biodiversity. And I think because human beings eventually learn. I mean, we are a learning species. I mean, we are quite stupid in many ways, but we do learn. And my hope is that new political designs, new political imaginations, new ideas about what would constitute sovereignty, not simply in global and therefore in only human terms, but also in planetary and therefore in terms of biodiversity. I must say one thing that I find very encouraging is Partha Dasgupta, the Cambridge economist, the biodiversity report he published in the name of the royalty, for the royalty. But it's the first time that I find an economist reading earth system science, working with a biologist like Ehrlich, but also reading biology and geology to some degree carefully enough to say that, okay, how can economics not treat it as an externality and make the category internal to the discipline? So his argument is, like a good economist, put a price on it. Because economists, so long as you put a price on it, I can deal with it. If there's no price on it, as an economist, I don't know what to say about it, right? So these are good signs. These are good signs as an academic, and disciplines will find their own path to the crisis. I mean, I found my path as a historian, but I think you're a political geographer,
Yes.
So even
political geographers can find paths everywhere.
Right. So exactly. So, but I think economics. It's very heartening to see this happening in economics. I doubt his chances of getting the Nobel Prize in the next couple of years, but one day I think they'll recognize that he did a good, very noble job.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you, Dipesh. A lot for us to consider. I think it's probably a good time to open it up now that we've thought about some of the different possibilities also for a good Anthropocene future as well. So I'm looking at the back. I'm a little bit blinded by the light, so that's all good. So that means I can't actually see anybody who's asking a question at the moment. So I don't know whether that might mean that could we change the lighting a little bit? Otherwise I won't be able to see anybody. I could do that. It's a bit inelegant. Yeah, let's make me darker, you lighter, something like that. Oh, yes. Oh, look.
It's better.
And see, look, loads of people have already got their hands up in the dark.
Right.
So that was great. So we've got one here, and then one other in the back, and then at the front. Yeah, please.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Dimitri. I'm at Queen Mary University. I want to pick up on a really interesting strand of your argument, the question of what is society in this context, who is the collective we here, and link that a little bit to what you were saying at the end in relation to new political designs and imaginations. And I think it's interesting that when we start to think about these new forms of collective agency, you mentioned then a multilateral or multinational authority for the Himalaya. We kind of fall back on, I'm an international lawyer, like pretty standard, relatively modernist designs of international executive authority. And that still kind of leaves lots of the sort of vibrancy of the planetary sort of to the sides. It's kind of a modernist enterprise of collective action. And I think we have some other ways of doing that maybe. I think Bruno Latour towards the end of his life was thinking in that direction of the sort of geosocial class or the more than human public or things like that. And I just would like to ask you in the condensed question, how do you think in these new more hopeful planetary politics, what might a planetary public be?
Dipesh, what will a planetary public look like, and can we move beyond modernist institutions for it? I'm going to take one more question so we get two in the room, if I may. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned this idea of the great flourishing.
Will you speak up a little bit?
Okay.
Hard of hearing even without
Okay.
with my hearing aids on.
You mentioned the idea of the great flourishing.
Right.
And you correlated that with the great acceleration. I'm just wondering how far the great flourishing actually applies to places like Africa. It seems to be an idea that comes mostly from very rich parts of America, the United States, or at least from the West. And I think there are parts of the deep rural South that would disagree that there is a great flourishing.
Thank
but
you
I'm
very
thinking
much.
particularly of other parts of the world, like Africa. Does
Thank
it apply there?
So is that idea of the
Yeah.
since the 50s that everything has got better everywhere for everyone?
No,
Does that need to be questioned?
no,
And then
sure.
how do we deal with the more hopeful
the
planetary
public,
politics?
the planetary public, yeah. Both great questions too, but let me take the second one first. I mean, I don't think the flourishing means that everybody has flourished equally well. But even this was a discussion we were having in the late afternoon. From the figures that I have seen, in many places, even the lifespan of the poor has expanded, not as much as that of the rich. Overall, the documentation of a global globally increasing middle class, including new African middle class, you will find that you will even find this on the internet from articles by Abhijit Binayak Banerjee and Esther Duflo, the economists. Again, that doesn't mean a very affluent middle class, because the bottom level is like $10 a day, so that's not great. But somebody was asking if this was a boomer's problem, flourishing. It probably part was a boomer. I think that's my generation, my lifetime. It's happened. So to speak of the great flourishing in terms of what we have enjoyed is not to deny inequality, but actually to acknowledge that inequality may grow alongside a growing middle class. In other words, some people are making it, and that's what produces the aspiration revolution in these countries, right? So remember that urbanization is happening throughout the world at a very fast rate. One effect of that is, I read in a recent survey of the English language in this country, said over 200 years, and said that there's a nature-related words are in sharp decline. Right? So people are subscribing more to urban lifestyles, being exposed to, the rich and the glittering. But some of them are also having access to it. So my argument would be that today there's a north in the south and a south in the north. And there are years when the global GDP of the global south is actually higher than the global GDP of the global north. And going back to the question of the planetary, the public. But Latour wrote that book with my good friend, they're both good friends, Nikolai Schulz, on the ecological class. And I actually think if one day we have biodiversity included into the understanding of sovereignty, so that sovereignty was not humans alone, that will probably initially come with a human sense of responsibility. But it's very hard to know how these imaginations will flourish. But it's clear that to think of sovereignty only as protecting human life is not working. And we are actually endangering human life, because one way in which, climate change has many proxy presentations, which are symptoms of climate change, but they don't look like climate change. And one of the proxy presentations is health related. Global health is going to be more and more important in our discussions. And it will turn out that we are not able to defend global health simply by the old geopolitics, which takes the earth as immobile and the boundaries as fixed. So whether trees and birds get into our John Stuart Mill's idea of representative politics is a different question. They may not, because you might actually create constitutionally minority categories, minorities that are constitutional minorities, which doesn't go with the idea of representative democracy. But in other forms, yes, I think I often, Latour was a very good friend and I'd learned a lot from him, and I often think of him as the Thomas More of our age, having wonderful utopian visions, which one day may realize themselves, but not exactly in the form in which he imagined them, but in some other ways.
Thank you, Dipesh. I've got one question there, and then another question at the front, and then three. Yes, so one, Kazia, would you go? And then at the front, and then back to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much. I really enjoyed this discussion, and I especially enjoyed hearing about your optimistic sort of political visions. And I have a question that I guess is, based on what you've said, a sort of small question about the global and not about the planetary. In the climate of history in a planetary age, you describe what you refer to as lumpers and splitters. And these are two different ways of thinking that about how to produce human emancipation. And in describing the splitters, you say the splitters are people who believe that human emancipation is only possible through addressing inequalities among humans. And you write, I was myself a child of this tradition. And so I guess my question for you is, do you believe that human emancipation is possible through climate action without addressing inequalities among humans?
That's a nice small question, thank you. There's another one at the front here, if we might, we'll just bring a microphone down to the front. Sure. This person, gentleman in the front row, thank you very much.
Help me remember the question.
Yes, I am, sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Chakrabarty. I'm a huge admirer of your contribution. So your earlier works, provincializing Europe and so on, grapples with philosophically about decolonization through, Derrida and Heidegger. So I'm just wondering if, in your work on the Anthropocene, do you have like a similarly robust philosophical system that you are thinking through about this problem? Because, in continental philosophy or right now there's this new strand of thinking which moves beyond the human subject. The traditions of object-oriented ontology of Graham Harman, or the speculative materialism of Quentin Meillassoux, etc. And on the other hand, there's this post-structuralist and even psychoanalytic tradition, which again center stages the subject. Like say Freud, for example, would talk about this enormous capacity that human beings have for self-sabotage or the death drive. And there are these progressive Freudians who would think about emancipatory movements as trying to kind of actualize or generalize the death drive in the form of collective sacrifice, etc. So I mean, it works very well with decolonization and progressive struggles, but with respect to climate change and so on, this infinite capacity for self-sabotage is translating today in this, like say in Delhi or the rest of India, the kind of pollution, etc., that we are seeing with through firecrackers in Diwali. So I don't know, where you stand on this question. Thank you.
On the Delhi problem.
What to do about firecrackers is possibly beyond Dipesh.
Right.
But I think,
Yeah,
Sarah,
okay,
if I may, we'll just take these two questions because
Okay,
they're quite large
okay, yeah.
questions.
Sorry, just-
and then,
yeah.
so one, the first question was about...
Just in the interest of time, I mean, we
Yes.
should have a longer discussion. I'll give you a philosophical answer to this question. Okay, just in the interest of time, because otherwise it take a long time. So, so you see, the idea of emancipation. The 19th century was a century of emancipations. Both feminist emancipation, it starts with emancipation from slavery, ends up with all these Latin American countries becoming independent, another form of emancipation, and the idea of proletarian, like Marxist emancipation from oppression. So in the 20th century, I think of two thinkers. One is Immanuel Wallerstein, saying that human wants two kinds of freedom. One is freedom from oppression by other human. The other one is freedom from the thraldom of nature. And Hannah Arendt, in a posthumous essay, talked about two kinds of freedom. One was freedom from want. The other one was freedom from fear. And I understood the second one saying, in my case, freedom from the fear of white men. Right? That was I just thought, yeah, decolonize. Gandhi was always talking about abhay, fearlessness. And many struggles against oppression actually would emphasize fearlessness. And I think they were both right, but they were not thinking planetarily from my point of view, right? And see, when India became independent, and I'm giving an Indian example, Nehru, main problem was food. There have been so many famines during British rule. So I sometimes say, what the modern technology did was we used to pray up to heavens, right? There's a Bengali folk song which says, Allah make the pani, Allah give us clouds, give us water. What technology was made us look to the ground. Now we will irrigate, and we will actually either create dams, and then or we will draw water from aquifers with pumps. So his emphasis was on electricity and dam building. Indian agriculture was solar powered right through British rule. We began to consume coal on a big scale after independence. And in his office, he used to have a map of India with all the rivers distinguished in terms of whether they had been dammed or they were still to be dammed. He had this binary, completely what Heidegger says, that it's like when you look at a waterfall and think electricity. Right? So we've been through that kind of imagination, and that emancipation, for all its faults, even with all the faults of Indian economy, has worked. Again, there's more inequality, but not immiseration of the kind. So, the working class in England became richer towards the end of the 19th century. That didn't mean that the inequality didn't grow, but their own standard of living went up, right? So that kind of feature, with all its faults, I see. The problem today is that the population has grown, and they're urbanizing, and the cities don't have the infrastructure all Indian cities, Bangladeshi cities I know are becoming unlivable. And pollution is just one simple index of it. When I go to Bangladesh, I was once gave a talk saying that, one way to count it is how expensive quiet has become.
Yeah.
You want to have a chat with a friend, you go to a 5-star hotel. You can't have a chat outside, right? So there are all these things, and I think our development patterns hadn't taken environment seriously. Now, 2018, the Supreme Court of India ordered an investigation, and you know what they found? That 18 hills of the Rajasthani hills, they exist on topographical maps, but they had gone missing. Imagine 18 hills going missing. They're not. You go there and they're not there because of illegal quarrying to feed the building boom in India and Bangladesh. Right? So that's, and coming back to your question, I can't get into the details of it. I'll lose my audience within a minute. If I say Derrida and Lacan and post-structuralism, those were very dear to my heart. I still, the globe-planet distinction also, what I find always is that I think with these people and I think with Heidegger, but so he opens up a question for me, and then I find that I don't want to go where he ends up, right? So he is interesting, and I think the climate problem as a philosophical problem, Stephen Gardner, who is an analytical philosopher, has a book called A Perfect Storm on the climate problem. So analytical philosophers also do it differently than continental philosophy. But climate problem is let me put it this way. When I understood what the problem was, I realized that evolution had not equipped us to deal with this. And for this reason, that basically all your evolved traits, you know what in risk literature is called everyday heuristics. Questions like, why do humans trust their own experience more than knowledge, abstract knowledge? Right? That is called everyday. Sometimes psychologists study it, but these are evolved traits. Every evolved trait is a trait that has helped you to survive. Necessarily means survival is about short-term thinking. How do I get beyond today? It's like the way the poor person would think. How do I get beyond today to deal with tomorrow? And cognitively, this is a crisis that is asking us to think long-term. And that's why governments are failing. Their conceptions of security and all these are short-term. I have to fight a war with China, I fight it today. Tomorrow I make friends. I have a skirmish with Pakistan, I have it today. Tomorrow we make friends. And I think that, for me, is one of the deepest conundrums of this crisis. If humanity could plan it, they would not want to have this kind of crisis. They would want to have the Israel-Palestine kind of crisis, where one day it will happen, you can hope, the future is infinite. Whereas the climate crisis was the future collapsing with these kind of numbers, like 2050 you must do this by, otherwise bad. So what, philosophically to me, as someone who loves history, his philosophies of history, I think we emerged from the 19th century in the 20th century with an European heritage that, as Carl Lewis said, the idea is not mine, that had secularized the Christian and Islamic idea of paradise. So the promise was in the 19th century, like Marx's 1875 Gotha program, and this idea that from each person according to their ability to their needs, this was paradise. It's redefining plenty. Just as the American economists redefined scarcity, Marx redefined plenitude by assuming that's how it will work. And so this happy ending story, that future we have lost. We now have a more finite future, talking about, how finite, who knows. But we have to, that's the condition, as you were saying, that's the condition in which we find ourselves. We will have to learn to be political within that. We'll have to learn to answer the question of how to inhabit this condition. And it's not the same condition the whole world over, right? It's not the same condition income-wise it's distributed. It is a distributed problem. And therefore the politics of distribution remains in place. But there is also an overall problem that the scientists worked out. That problem is the hardest to, like IPCC targets, which require synchronization. There's the synchronicity of politics will be very difficult to achieve.
Thank you, Dipesh. I'm looking at my host and wondering whether I'm allowed another couple of questions, or No, I'm not.
Can I invite you to say something as somebody who has been dealing with this as a geologist for a long time?
I think I have about 30 seconds left. I'm being
A
advanced.
glorious 30 seconds.
But yes,
There's a microphone.
you're going to need the
microphone.
mic. There we go.
Okay, thank you. Yes, yes. I mean, I'm living myself in a new world here. You know, so and as a geologist in this kind of company, I always feel 9 3/4 years old. But if I can ask a question, which is, you say that geology is becoming part of history in that sense. Is the nature of the changes we're seeing, which is a different kind of world. That was Paul Crutzen's point. It's not that humans are changing the Earth, it's that the Earth is being changed. Is that altering the patterns and course of the history that you study in a way that you will have to approach the discipline differently?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Dipesh, you're allowed to answer it. Or do we leave this hanging?
Okay,
Because if I leave you answering it,
it is changing.
I have you also on 30 seconds, I think.
Right. Yeah. But I would say the kind of changes to which you and your colleagues have made us aware of, which that is obviously having an impact on human politics. Human politics is lagging. The political conceptions lag behind what's needed. It would be silly of me to immediately spell out what's needed, because what's needed will emerge from circumstances. But I think the more we become aware of both the global and the planetary as perspectives from which to look at our own lives, and then the less humanocentric it is, whatever our questions are, and we incorporate both other forms of life and forms of non-life that we need. We need the mountain, right? We need the mountain to produce the glaciers. And so as we become aware of our position in this planet, I'm sure we will try to make the planet more habitable for other creatures and other forms of life, because that's the only condition for our own habitability.
Thank you very much, Dipesh. Thank you for the very rich questions that we've had. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dipesh and Harriet, for that fascinating conversation. I think there's a lot for us to absorb after that tonight, and sorry we couldn't answer everybody's questions. So Professor Chakrabarty will be taking part in the Smertz Memorial Lecture Series tomorrow at Cambridge University, titled This Planetary Life, but I think it's sadly sold out, so don't know if anyone here will be able to attend. But lastly, if you'd like to learn more about the British Academy's public policy work, it's exploring pathways to realise fair futures locally, nationally and globally. Please visit the Just Transitions programme on our website, where you can download copies of our reports with evidence papers if that takes your fancy. But meanwhile, the Living with the Planet series will continue this Thursday on the 30th with our art club, which is about writing wild worlds. So we're inviting 3 researchers in the fields of poetry, playwriting and literature to explore the vital role that creative writing can play in understanding the climate crisis and our natural world, whilst aiding our ability to imagine new futures and alternative ways of communicating those ideas. And this discussion will be followed by a poetry workshop. So if you're available and that sounds interesting to you, please come along. We still have tickets. But for now, thank you, everyone, and thank you for joining us. The bar is still open if you'd like a drink, and there's an evaluation at the exit if anyone feels like filling that out, because it's useful for us. So thank you all, and good night.